Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art. Ursula K. Lee. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski, but I'm joined by another host of another AMI audio show. Red Széll is the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio. Red, you're the one that gave me this quote, and I think, I don't have the context for this, but I think as I understand it, it's pointing out the idea that authors and artists more generally have a duty to challenge the status quo, to push buttons, if you want to put it that way. What's the context of this quote?
So Ursula K. Le Guin, who's a sci-fi author, she passed away a few years ago, she was speaking at the US National Book Awards, I think in 2014, and she really rocked people back on their heels by saying this. She was basically pointing out that, yes, authors do have a duty to challenge the status quo. And it chimes with something that actually Amitav Ghosh has written in his book, The Great Derangement, which is talking about climate change, that we might blame our politicians for getting things wrong, but future generations might blame the artists and authors whose job it is to challenge ideas, to challenge received wisdom. You know, it's politicians' job to keep the status quo going. It's an artist's job to ask the difficult questions, to test out different scenarios. And any human power was actually used as a title by an author I interviewed recently called Manda Scott, who is doing exactly that. She's looking at ideas that really do challenge the status quo. Can we do our society better? Can we organize ourselves better in the 21st century for the challenges that we face? And I mean, it's the kind of book that I love reading, something that just takes the status quo and goes, no, that's wrong. We can do better. We deserve better. Our children and our children's children deserve better. And we need to think about the future.
The idea that authors have a duty to challenge the status quo is pretty romantic. And I don't think if you were to ask most authors, if you were to ask them the question, what is your duty as an author? Do you think they would answer back, my job is to challenge the status quo of society? Like I have a feeling a lot of them would just say, I just want to tell good stories. But the quiet part is, I just want to make money.
Oh, look, yeah, I completely agree. Although, I mean, most authors don't make a huge amount of money. So, you know, if you want to get rich, you're not necessarily going to become an author. But right. No, I agree. Look, and it's horses for courses. Different genres do different things.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Yeah, literary fiction is often the genre that does that pushes the status quo. I think of books like To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which has been in the English class curriculum in Canada and the United States for decades now. And that's exactly what it does, is it challenges the status quo of the status and the current position of race relations in the United States, right? While it's looking at a time in the past, it's still extremely reflective of where we are now. And there's a lot of books that do this, especially older books. And there's an author that I know we both love, John Steinbeck. And I recently read Of Mice and Men. Fantastic short read. Anybody should get into. Extremely engrossing. Can be interpreted in a lot of ways. An interpretation that I've seen a lot online is that it's challenging the idea of the American dream. If that's not a perfect example of challenging the status quo, then I don't know what is.
I couldn't agree more. John Steinbeck is the only author who every single one of his books that I've read has managed to reduce me to tears. There is something about the human condition that John Steinbeck gets, and My favorite one of his books is The Grapes of Wrath,
Mm.
which in a foreword to the book, he actually wrote he set out to rend people's hearts. He was so disgusted by the behavior of American politicians and people in power during the Great Depression and the suffering that they had allowed to happen during the Depression, during the Dust Bowl, by the men who made money out of other people's misery, that he wrote The Grapes of Wrath to out them, to basically say this is wrong and it shouldn't be repeated. And I admire that. And look, I don't want to read a polemic every single time I sit down and read a novel, but I think once a year I want a book that is just really going to challenge the status quo and from which we can learn. And it doesn't matter that John Steinbeck wrote that book, 85 years ago, maybe longer, actually, nearly 90 years ago, but it still resonates today. There are the same social challenges facing people in the West that still need to be addressed. And we should learn from history, and our authors should point out the shortcomings of our society if they want to take that tack.
What John Steinbeck does that's particularly interesting is he seems to have a reoccurring theme in a lot of his books. And that theme is the average person, the average American, the forgotten person, the farmhand migrant worker working in California, or the lowly fisherman on the southern coast of California, right? And just the middle class, the working class, and I don't want to say mundane, but the average real stories. Like, while he's telling fiction, his stories feel very grounded and real. And the way that you painted the foreword to The Grapes of Wrath and the whole context behind his disgust of society and the class divide during the Dust Bowl, it really comes off like a challenge. And how did you put it? Like, he was telling them off. He was basically calling them out.
I've got the quote here. I want to put a tag on the greedy bastards who are responsible for the Great Depression and its effects. That is, if that's not throwing down a gauntlet. The Grapes of Wrath are referred to, I think it's in chapter 25 of the book, where the song, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is stamping out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. His truth goes marching on, and that was why Steinbeck chose the title. I think it was his wife's suggestion, actually. The truth goes marching on. There will be some divine retribution for the sins of man when it comes to the reckoning of the days of Revelation. And at the end of chapter 25, he quotes the grapes of wrath in relation to a group of farmers who are destroying fruit that could be eaten by the starving people simply and solely to keep the price artificially high. And that was the injustice that Steinbeck set out to highlight and to criticize. And the same kind of manipulation of the commodity prices for various commodities that we all use is being done today by the same money men. It's probably being done behind a computer screen now rather than squelched underfoot. But, these things need to be pointed out by the writers who count themselves as social commentators. And I think Steinbeck certainly did. He was offended by people who would allow his fellow men to suffer and die just simply to put a few extra dollars in their own pockets.
When you're talking about price manipulation and how frustrating it was to John Steinbeck, it makes me think of Galen Weston, who's the president and CEO of Loblaws, which Loblaws is the company that owns the monopoly of grocery stores in Canada.
Right, okay.
And there is over and over been price fixing scandals around them. And there's so much anger around what Loblaws is doing now. And I'm only pointing out Loblaws here in Canada because it's a direct tie to what John Steinbeck was trying to point out in the inequalities that you've pointed out in The Grapes of Wrath. And it's a good example of how an older book that points out a societal issue can still be just as relevant today, because it's about the human condition. And no matter how technology evolves, how our society evolves, the human condition stays the same.
Oh, yeah. People's motivations, people's greed, people's wish to be better than their neighbors or look down on their neighbors, persists from the days people started writing down stories to the present day. It's a terrible truth that human beings don't change. I mean, it's a wonderful truth that human beings don't change in some ways because we still love our neighbors. But
exactly, we still love our neighbors, right? And that's part of the human condition, because you mentioned a lot of negative things about the human condition, our greed, our lust for power, our lust for lust. We also have a need for community and connection, and for love and for purpose. And those things never change either.
Absolutely. And, the love shown by the Joad family for their fellow travelers on the road to hope out to California, which just seems to be, paved with shards of glass. And yet they still are kind and generous and give what they can to those who they perceive are suffering more than them, even though they have absolutely nothing. And it's the widow's mite. It's our ability to give away what we have to save other people, which gives all of us hope, I think, and forms a lot of the beauty in literature. And that's why Steinbeck makes me cry every time I read him. There is the worst of humanity and there is the best of humanity in Steinbeck's books. And the way he juxtaposes those two just has me in tears every single time. What a great writer.
I've read The Mice and Men by John Steinbeck and The Pearl, which is the story of a fisherman who finds an extremely rare pearl, and it basically gives him, it's kind of like he won the lottery because he becomes extremely rich very quickly. But this book was written before the lottery became a thing in the United States, and kind of predicted that scenario where lottery winners actually wind up being a lot worse off after they've won the lottery than before because of human greed. This dude had such a grasp on the human condition, specifically how greedy people are, that he was able to predict the future from it, just saying that, the human condition doesn't change. So in this type of scenario, this is what would happen. And he was super on point.
Absolutely. And I'm sure Steinbeck is taught just as much in Canadian schools as it is in British schools. And my American friends say that in most states of the United States, Steinbeck is still very much on the curriculum. His work endures. The truth endures, and we can learn from it. I think I read, I must have read of Mice and Men for the exams I did when I was 15 or 16. And I just remember being absolutely devastated by it.
I know.
And I was I've read it several times since. And I think when my daughter was studying it, I was going, you are so lucky. I'd love to write essays about that again. So, and instead I get to talk to you on radio, which is just great. So it's,
I was making dinner at the time when I was listening to The Mice and Men, specifically the ending. And I had to stop. I was tearing up right then and there, just standing up in the kitchen in front of the stove. That ending absolutely destroyed me. And then having to analyze it, because that book is great because you can interpret it in so many different ways. There's so much to pull from it, and from a relatively simple story as well. Red, I want to go back to something you said earlier, and it's this like push and pull dynamic between the politician's role to maintain the status quo and the artist's role to challenge the status quo. The thing is, art as we know it didn't really exist before any kind of mass media, and I include the printing press in there. How does that dynamic work before the printing press? I'm just thinking out loud here.
Well, so Greek tragedy, which I must say I love. I know a lot of people will probably roll their eyes at that. But, 2,500 years ago, the Greeks have their Dionysian festival, and they have playwrights like Sophocles and Aeschylus writing tragedies. Tragedy actually comes from a word meaning goat, and if you won the writing competition, the play competition, you would win a goat. So it's a goat play. There's a useless fact for you. And yet these plays were very critical of what was going on. So I think it was Sophocles and Aeschylus were criticizing the Peloponnesian Wars, which the Athenian state had rather disastrously entered into, and which had cost lots and lots of lives. And these playwrights were writing hour-and-a-half long plays, which basically turned around to the government and gone, "You've screwed up. You have shown hubris. You have, shown too much too much belief in your own way of seeing things, and you've offended the gods, and therefore you are going to be punished." And so, I think drama, spoken word poems like the Iliad. The Iliad is a great work, but we all sit there and go, "Oh, well, the Greeks must be the heroes because Homer was Greek." Oh, no, actually, you read it closely, they are our sympathy lies really with the Trojans, the losing side. Sorry, spoiler alert.
It's okay. The book's been out for 2,000 years. I think we're okay.
Exactly. The Greeks were very introspective, and through drama, through spoken word performance, they challenged the status quo. Shakespeare did it as well, in his plays. His plays aren't. He had to be careful. He obviously didn't want to end up in the Tower of London or have his head chopped off. But there's some criticism of the status quo in Shakespeare. So some of his, majority of his plays were only noted down after his death, and that was by hand. But again, I think plays, performance, spoken word is a very good way of conveying thought, action, and a wish for change.
It's one thing to be an artist and to put out a message that challenges the status quo, but it's another thing for the audience to take it in and do something of it. But when you're reading a book and there's a lesson to be learned, you internalize it. Like, it's not like I'm walking around and just on a normal day and I come across some sort of injustice and then I see it and then I get a PSD style flashback to when I was reading To Kill a Mockingbird and go, "Oh man, I need to do what Atticus Finch did." You internalize the values that the book is espousing. It's not like a one-to-one lesson where you need to copy the protagonist of the book. It's about teaching the audience, the listeners, the readers, the value that you're trying to espouse. And basically, I think what artists and writers do Is the trade she's the value of certain values, if that makes sense. Like the value of a value, why it's important to have convictions. It's the value of having convictions based on your values. It's like it's a cyclical relationship between your convictions and your values, and understanding why they're important, why they're valuable. Does that make sense? Am I getting a little too heady here?
No, I agree. Look, no author picks up the pen or puts their fingers on the keyboard thinking, I'm just gonna write for the hell of it. I think
exactly.
Stories gestate inside authors, and even the not so good ones. There is a reason why they write, and I think that's it. And the stronger the conviction, maybe the stronger the, I don't want to say messaging of the book, but the polemics of this world do come from very strong convictions. The weaker the conviction, probably the more light and fluffy the book. But everybody writes, every author writes for a reason. They want to get something out, and if it's a strong message, I think it really can chime with the author. And it's next week's episode of My Life in Books is a case in point. I interviewed a fantastic young American author called Rachel Stark, whose work actually really does rather remind me of John Steinbeck in its rawness, in its contrast of the vastness of the Californian rural landscape and the claustrophobia of the hard lives of its blue collar characters. And she's writing about Perris, California, where she grew up in the 1990s. And there's an anger there. It's a land of mamas, boys, and broken dreams. And it's about the resilience of women trying to hold all that together when, basically they have very little else than the lives that they lead. They have, it's a poor life. It's the America that the politicians forgot. And that's, 60 years after John Steinbeck.
That sounds an awful lot like John Steinbeck.
Yeah.
Did you interview the author for this one?
Yeah, Rachel Stark.
And how was that interview? Like, I'm curious. Like, what was the tone of it? I'm just curious what kind of questions that you asked her.
I asked her very much about, well, basically why she wrote the book. I mean, it's kind of what we're talking about. The main themes in it, and how her female characters do consider motherhood, and maybe it's not such a great world to bring kids into. Maybe it makes life even more of a struggle for poor families, and yet it's something that's expected of them. And the support network is entirely feminine. The men are going out and doing hard physical jobs and trying to keep the finances together. It's the women's job to hold the family together, and it's a brutal world. So I thought it was a very interesting interview. I hope listeners agree when they listen to next week's interview, as it goes out on Monday.
Yeah, and you can also find it wherever you listen to podcasts. The name of the show is My Life in Books. I'm assuming that's your life that the title is referencing to, Red. Red, thank you so much. It's never a struggle to have you on the show. You're the best. Thanks so much.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
That was Red Széll. He's the host of My Life in Books. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. AMI Audiobook Review airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. But we also make ourselves easy to find. We're on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can email us at audiobookreview@ami.ca if you have any feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And you can also follow us on our Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. It's not just for plugging the next episode. We have special featured content and exclusive content as well. Mostly a lot of highlights from this show. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.